الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. All praises be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Lord of the world, sustainer of the world, cherisher of the world. We send blessings on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Brothers, again, inshallah, we are here for our second podcast, continuing with the four great Imams, why we follow them. And inshallah, without sort of any sort of introduction, I think we're going to go into it. So I'm going to begin with the first question to our Sheikh Faizan and Muhammad. So we left off last time on the school of Imam Abu Hanifa. So today, after we're going to move on to the other legal schools. So, what are the other three main legal schools? Could you give us a bit of a background and a bit of details to them?
Certainly. Uh, I think it's important for us to appreciate that the times of these early Imams were unique times. This was the time when the schools of thought were forming, the madhahib were developing, and the corpus of knowledge that the Ummah received from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from the Sahaba, began to be formulated in a way to benefit the rest of the Ummah from there on, you see. So Al-Imam Abu Hanifa was in many ways the wadi' of this new formulation. And during his time, there were many of the students, many of the people began to ask a whole range of diverse questions. New issues arose. Remember, the Ummah is now expanding, and the Ummah is going to different countries, different cultures. They're encountering new phenomena. And because of that, it necessitated a more rigorous, not only the bringing together of the prophetic, the corpus of the prophetic knowledge, but also to formulate principles of interpreting them, you see. And so, other than Imam Abu Hanifa, there is also the fiqh of Imam Malik ibn Anas, who resided in the blessed city of Madinatul Munawwara. He had the blessed opportunity to really, in many ways, absorb the barakah of Medina, but also the barakah of the scholarship of Medina. And so his was the next school of thought to really emerge and develop and to be formalized into a systematic way of interpreting the ahkam. Uh, I guess the key feature of the Maliki madhab is really in many ways, we could say that it is the amal of the people of Medina. So the amal of the people who lived in the city of the Prophet ﷺ itself became a hujjah. Remember last week we looked at the principles of Islamic law, the usul, yeah, the basis of our dalil, and we came to this understanding the most profound, the most primary sources of the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in addition to that, it was qiyas and ijma'. Um, Imam Malik's school of thought had another principle, which was the amal of the Ahlul Madina. Now, in many ways, the amal of the Ahlul Madina, meaning the practice of the people of Medina, became a dalil, and in many ways, it corresponded to the sense of ijma' in the other schools of thought. So what the people of Medina came to a collective understanding, that became a dalil in its own right. And there are the principles, the masalih mursala, in terms of looking at public interest. It was a new phenomena adopted from the Quran and Sunnah, a new, we would say, a zabita. Zabita is a type of principle or perspective of looking at something. And so this was developed in his school of thought. Um, Imam Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i. We're just going to do a very quick overview because we've got lots of questions, inshallah. So it's going to be a very brief overview. Imam Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i uh, is the founder of what we say is the third school of Islamic legal reasoning. Um, and he happened, one of the features of Imam al-Shafi'i is that he benefited both from the fiqh of Imam Abu Hanifa and the fiqh of Imam Malik. right? So he was a direct student of Imam Malik. He was also a direct student of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani. And so he could have a more uh, a broader perspective. We may say this afforded him a broader perspective. What's really interesting is Imam Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i. He develops the science of usulul fiqh and systemizes it to the point that it's really comes to surface in written form, really. So he's what we would say is the wadi' of the usulul fiqh, the one who really found the science of usul. Although the mujtahideen before him also had their usul, but the way in which it was formulated by Shafi'i, it was unique, and he was the first person to really do that. Um, what's really unique about the Shafi'i madhab is that it's also this emphasis on the sunnah, and this is something which is Imam Shafi'i was very, very firm on to make sure that the hadith of Rasulullah is incorporated to a large extent in the legal reasoning. That's not to say the others didn't. The others were great muhaddiseen as well, but this is a feature that comes out of Imam Shafi'i much more. Then there is the fiqh of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, who was the student of Imam Shafi'i, but Imam Shafi'i went to learn from him in the first place. But mashallah. So the point we're trying to make is that all of these imams are connected with each other. They belong to the same epoch. They belong to the same environment. Remember, each era of the Islamic development of the Ummah and the civilization occurred with key features. There was a feature where Tasawwuf later developed, and it had their own masters. Then there was a new phenomenon of Ilmul Kalam developing, and they were the masters of Ilmul Kalam. So these four imams really they belong to the epoch where the codification of Islamic law really took on a higher, more accentuated focus. And so they really, in many ways, then established their school of, not with the intention of establishing their own school of thought, they established their understanding of fiqh, which later was popularized by their students, and that was later popularized by their students, and eventually became and evolved into madahib. And we must say that not with the intention. Any of all of the Imams did not intend to establish their madhab, right? Imam Abu Hanifa didn't want to establish the Hanafi madhab, right? And the proof of that is during the times of all these Imams, the state authorities approached them. So Imam Malik was approached to make his a collection of hadith, the Muwatta, uh, into the official book of the state, and he refused. He refused. Uh, Imam Abu Hanifa was approached by the state to become Qadiul Quda, the chief judge scholar of the Muslim Islamic Empire, and again he went on the run. So it's an indication that these scholars were not interested in establishing their own schools of thought. They were focused on trying to understand the Quran and Sunnah. They had unique perspectives in terms of approaching the Quran and Sunnah. And so their ultimate aspiration was to understand the murad of Allah and the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then to impart that understanding for the ummah. It only later emerged by the barakah of their sincerity, by the sagacity, and uh, by their deep understanding and faham. They later were regarded as almost a hujjah, we would say. And that later became really the madahib, inshallah ta'ala.
Sometimes people ask that all these schools of fiqh, were they all Sunni? And there's a confusion that, you know, if we follow a different mazhab, maybe it's not Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. All these all legal schools, do they fall under the category of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah?
So the reality is that every single ijtihad of a mujtahid is belongs to Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, right? So we're not just saying the four, right? So the principle is anyone who is a mujtahid, we'll go on to this notion of taqleed shortly. Anyone who is a mujtahid and his ijtihad is based upon, following the prerequisites. So mujtahid, we're going to go on to that, inshallah. We're going to go on to that. We explained ijtihad last week briefly. So ijtihad, just now that you asked the question, um, but it's best to wait for the explanation to finish, and then inshallah, if there's still unanswered, then we can go into that. So ijtihad is the process through which a mujtahid, someone who's qualified to really to decipher and understand the meanings behind the import, particularly the import of the ahkam in relation to the mukallaf, right? So ijtihad is a systematic process whereby the scholar looks at the adillah. The scholar has a certain perspective on approaching the adillah. He has certain usul that he's developed and he's learnt and acquired from previous masters, and then he applies that legal reasoning to come to an understanding what Allah meant in relation to this hukam shar'i, what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam meant in relation to that the hukam shar'i. You see, now anyone who follows a mujtahid is from Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And so there were more than four schools of thought. There were numerous schools of thought. There was the school of thought of Imam Sufyan al-Thawri, who was a contemporary of Imam al-A'zam, Imam Abu Hanifa. There is another school of thought. Imam Tabari had his own school of thought, and there were numerous. So the point is that the other schools of thought, meaning the ijtihadat of the other mujtahids, uh, became in many ways, we won't say extinct, but they weren't popularized as much as the four that we've mentioned. It so happened, Mashiach of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the codification and the development and expansion only took place for the four. But to answer your question, anyone who's a mujtahid and they follow and their ijtihad is followed, they're from Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah.
So if somebody is a Shafi'i,
Yes.
is still a
Yes,
Sunni.
of course. Yes. No.
Okay, we hear a word taqleed, yeah, in fiqh, that we do taqleed. What's taqleed?
I mean, I guess another issue that we might mention is the polemic against taqlid. So often when taqlid is opposed, I mean, I'll ask you the question. What do people say when people do taqlid?
Yeah,
What's
okay,
the
so yeah,
objection?
yeah. So some people say that we should follow the Quran and Sunnah,
Yes.
and for sake they say we shouldn't follow people.
Yes,
So they
yes.
say we
Yeah.
because
That
Quran and Sunnah are
yeah.
they're
Yeah,
like they're
that
formal sources,
yeah.
book sources.
Yeah.
What why should they follow a person, a human
Yeah.
being?
Yeah. That's a very, very good observation, and that's quite uh, prevalent now, a lot more now. It's in many ways it's an attack on people who do taqlid, and it's almost polemical, meaning that people raise this objection with dalil and with argumentation and munazara and bahas. And so the basic premises of this is that we have the Quran and Sunnah. uh, why do we leave the Quran and the Sunnah and follow another Imam? So following Imam Abu Hanifa or Imam Malik or Imam Sufyan al-Thawri, Imam Tabari, and all of these great mujtahideen, right, is actually going against the Quran and Sunnah, right? And so this is the general premise. Okay. Yes. My understanding is that why do we follow these things? Like we have Holy Quran. Yes. And we have the Hadith as well. Yes. And we follow them, we are on the right path. Yes. That's the contradiction. That why do we follow these people then? Yes. We are not divine people. They are the people who have learned the Holy Quran. Of course. And he just argue that why do we do that? Ideally, you have to follow Holy Quran. Yes. That's the bottom line. Yes. The moment you reach the bottom line, you are on the right path. Yeah. So we will come on to how we follow the Quran and Sunnah as well. But the general polemic against people who do taqleed, and we'll go on to the definition of taqleed shortly, is that we have the Quran, we have the Sunnah. Why do we follow Abu Hanifa when we have Rasulullah, when we have Kalamullah, right? That's the first argument. The second argument is that it's because of taqleed, just following one Imam blindly. Okay, the Ummah is in decline, and the way the Ummah is revived again is when we, renew ijtihad and so on and so forth. So the first response is, number one, when we say we follow the opinion and understanding of Abu Hanifa, we do not say that we go against the Quran and Sunnah. Number one. So Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, Imam Shafi'i, and all of these great Imams, they were themselves following the Quran and Sunnah. They were themselves. And there's a common narration which is really interesting from each of the Imams, and which is being passed on to their students, who passed on and later written in their books. Each of the Imams have always said, and this statement is quite unique because so the statement is, Imam Abu Hanifa says that if you find a hadith and you have my qawl or my interpretation. When the scholars say qawl, they mean their interpretation. And you find a hadith which goes against that, then throw my qawl against the wall. Right? And so similar statements have been mentioned by Shafi'i, by Malik, by all of the great mujtahideen. So the first point is that these imams weren't fabricating their own law, right? They weren't making their own law. They were interpreting the Quran and Sunnah. That's why we start off with usulul fiqh. Usulul fiqh are Quran and Sunnah, meaning that the Imams look in the Quran first, they understand the murad of Allah, right? Then they look at Sunnah in terms of how that hukam Shar'i was implemented by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then they come to an understanding, right? Then they come to an so they're understanding the basis, the usul, is the Quran and Sunnah, right? So now you may say, why is it that there's so much difference? Why is it that in spite of all these people following the Quran and Sunnah, surely we should have had one interpretation? Why we have four, five, or six? And some cases there's almost nine different interpretations. Why? Because of the way in which the Aimma Mujtahideen interpret the law. They look at the Quran and Sunnah with certain usul, with certain principles, right? So for example, just to give you one example, in the fiqh of Imam Abu Hanifa, when you have something mentioned by something which is qat'u subut wa qat'u dalala, meaning if something is mentioned in the Quran, something is mentioned in the Quran explicitly, the hukam is mentioned in the Quran. If, for example, there's a hadith which is from Khabrul Wahid, meaning that is a single chain narration, meaning that usually one or two people have narrated that hadith, right? So it's like we'd say a solitary report. If that solitary report seems to say something different to what the Quran mentions, then that particular solitary report will not be accepted in relation to changing the hukum that's mentioned in the Quran. You see, that's not to say it's rejected altogether, but so we have a principle of tatbiq. But the hukum of the Quran remains because of qati'u dalala, qati'u subut. So you can't have something which is zanniul dalala, like a khabrul wahid is a solitary report. In terms of its evidential authority, it doesn't have the same level of authority as something which is mutawatir. And the Quran being mutawatir and khabrul wahid being a solitary, so it has zanniul dalala. So you prefer the qati'u dalala. So what you've done is you follow the Quran, with deeper impact, you see. And so each of the Imams has a certain usul, has a certain principle, certain lens, certain, we might say, methodology of approaching the Quran and Sunnah. But the basis of their ahkam, their hukam, the interpretation are always Quran and Sunnah, or the ijma of the Ahlul Madina, okay? And only where the new issues have been formulated, the new issues, when new issues arise, then we have really the realm of ijtihad, right? And so where we have the nas, لا في في مورد النص, meaning when we have a nas, there's no need for ijtihad, right? So ijtihad arises, and then these scholars do their own ijtihad based upon what the usul they've acquired from the Quran and Sunnah. They do some kind of tatbiq, they look at the illah, they look at the hukam, and so it's a very technical, very, very deep, very well established way of interpreting the law. So the reality is they all follow the Quran and Sunnah. So you were asking a question. Yes.
First one is a lot of the still Hanafis, they say that statement of Imam Abu Hanifa saying that if a better opinion comes after, they take that. They'll say that's out of humility.
No, they're completely wrong. So anyone who says that it was out of humility, they're making a mockery of Abu Hanifa. When Abu Hanifa said that if you have my qawl, right, and it seems to contradict the qawlul Rasul sallallahu as in the hadith, right? He really meant throw my qawl against the wind, against the wall, like deny it, reject it, right? So it's not out of humility because this is actually arrogance. So if they say it's out of humility, so when you have Quran and Sunnah and you have a qawl of another person, uh, to deny the Quran and Sunnah is the essence of arrogance. So it's not out of humility that Abu Hanifa said, reject my call and because who's Abu Hanifa compared to Allah and the Messenger, right? Imam al-Azam Abu Hanifa was a great scholar. He was a great abid. He was a great zahid, but he was a human being. He was fallible. He did not have isma. He didn't have direct revelation to him, right? So compared to the Quran and Sunnah, his or anyone else for that matter is nothing. You see.
Sorry, but just on the subject, just to make it more clear, when Imam Abu Hanifa makes that statement, is it for the common person to look at the hadith and analyze it, or is that for scholarship?
No, we're going to come on to that.
That
We're going to come on to that when we look at
it's not for
taqleed.
the
Yeah.
common person, is it?
Yeah. When we go into the hukam of taqleed, we'll answer that
Yeah.
question in that. So one more question.
And the question, say for example, like Imam Malik came up with what the hadith and whatnot. How come the later Hanafi scholars didn't take their opinions if they were stronger?
No, it look in terms of Imam Malik compiled his Muwatta. That Muwatta was in most cases Khabrul Wahid, right? Let's say there are mutawatir hadiths in there, but the mujtahid when he looks at the Quran and Sunnah, he looks at the Quran and Sunnah with a certain usul. So, for example, if for example there's a mutawatir hadith which mentions an aspect of hukum shar'i, no imam can deny that. So it's a legal fiction. No imam would deny mutawatir hadith because that's it's kufr to do that. So anything which is sabata, ma sabata, anything which is established in the Quran and from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and mentioned with tawatur and it's understood as well, meaning it's not only qati'ud subut, it's qati'ud dalala, it's explicit, uh, clear in meaning as well. Then to deny that is kufr.
Theoretically, say for example, Imam Abu Hanifa had more meaning in a certain thing than a more hadith that stronger opinion came across afterwards.
So can you give me an example of that? So then you should give examples, isn't it? You can't just say that. So next week, inshallah, bring a mutawatir hadith that Imam Abu Hanifa or the later Hanafis rejected, that Imam Malik narrated. Yeah.
How would that work?
It doesn't work. The point is you can't deny a mutawatir hadith, right? Unless for example, unless the meaning, mafhum of that mutawatir hadith. You see, like for example, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in relation to quru, periods, right? That's now qat'ud dalala. Yeah, qat'ud dalala, meaning Allah mentions the what in terms of the menstruation cycle and when talaq actually takes place after the 3 period. Now, some of the Aimma understood quru meaning tahara, 3 periods of pure tahara being away from menstruation cycle, right? Some of the imams interpret quru to with the meaning of being in haze, so 3 haze period. So even though it's qati'ud subut, but in terms of dalala, the different imams understood from that uh, that particular word meant this. Imam Shafi'i said it means this. Imam Abu Hanifa meant this. Same qati'ud, same subut, same usul, same asal, but different of there's a difference of understanding. But let's say, for argument's sake, if for example we had a, a definitive text on something and there was a definitive understanding of that, to go against that would be kufr. There's no mahallul ikhtilaf fi hada. Right? So, for example, in relation to Khatmun Nubuwah, Allah uses the word Khatamun Nabiyyin. The word Khatam means final, meaning the way the Ummah has understood Khatam here is that it means final. Right? There's ijma on that. There's no one in the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam who said that the Khatam means something else. You see, so where there is ijma, there is no. So, for example, if there's a mutawatir hadith, ma'nan is there's ijma, you can't go against that.
I just thought of an example. Just for example, Rafa Day, for example, like if there's a stronger opinion for Rafa Day, then half of the late Hanafi scholars didn't introduce that as well. Just
Well, so that's someone saying, look, every school of thought is going to say my opinion is stronger, right? Every school of thought is going to say my interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah is stronger. No one's gonna say, oh, I follow a weak opinion.
I get that.
Do you understand?
Yeah.
All right. No imam's gonna say, oh, well, we are wrong, but just because we're Hanafis, we're just gonna carry on being Hanafis, right? When a scholar, when your scholar studies the Hanafi fiqh, they study the adillah, they study the legal reasonings behind the ahkam, right? And we'll come on to that I think there's a question on can we follow the
I
different
think
schools
we
of
need to
thought?
move
Yeah,
on to the
inshallah, let's do that.
yeah, let's move on to taqleed and then hukum of taqleed as well. Do
Yeah.
that together, I think.
Now,
So,
so taqleed. So the word taqleed is from qalada, which basically means a sense of tying or binding. So qalada is like a necklace tied around the neck. Uh, so in the in the lugwi sense, it implies a sense of being held together or being bound together. The terminological meaning of taqleed is قبول قول الآخر بلا دليل أو بلا حجة, right? Another is قبول قول المجتهد بلا دليل, right? Meaning that to accept when we say qawl here, we don't mean just someone saying something. We say qawl means understanding, yeah? Acceptance of understanding of another scholar, of a scholar, bila dalil, without asking him for evidence, is taqleed. Now, in terms of the hukum of taqleed, right, I'll mention the hukum of taqleed and I'll mention the objection people raise in relation to this. The hukum of taqleed, as per the ijma of the Ummah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that taqleed is haram for a mujtahid. Taqleed is haram for a mujtahid, wajib for a non-mujtahid. Right? Right. Meaning, what does this mean? So if you are a person of ijtihad, you've developed a degree of Islamic scholarship, you've studied the usul, your knowledge of the Arabic the Arabic language is deep, and you know the athar of the language and so on and so forth. You know the ahadith, the ahkam, the nasikh, the mansukh, and all of these preconditions of ijtihad. If you are a mujtahid, then taqleed is haram for you. You cannot follow another man. You have to go directly to the Quran and Sunnah. Why? Because you have the tools to understand the means, the murad of Allah and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you are not a mujtahid, meaning that if you do not have that level of scholarship, that depth of understanding, that insight, the firasa, which is a combination of all of these things, then you cannot but follow another person who does have that qualification. You see, and the objection of that is, again, people say, but it's still like it's still following another person, right? The It's still following another. It's not Quran Sunnah. So let's look at how the Sahaba dealt with this issue. So before we do that, let's just clarify this issue, this definition of taqleed. So it's following a mujtahid without demanding evidence. It's following a mujtahid without demanding evidence, not following him against the evidence. Does that make sense? So I just wanted to clarify that point. So you follow a mujtahid without demanding evidence, without demanding dalil. What's the dalil for this? What's the dalil for this? Not that you're following him against the dalil, meaning that you're following him blindly. There's a dalil and you're going against that. That's not the meaning of taqleed. It's following a mujtahid without demanding evidence. Now, this issue without demanding evidence, where do we get that? Number one, we get that from the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of dhikr if you do not know. The Ahlul Dhikr here means the A'imma, the Ulama al-Rabbaniyin, the people of deep penetrating wisdom with understanding, the ability to do istinbat, extract law. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So if you are a person who does not know, who doesn't have the tools to understand, then فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ. Number two from the hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, Shifa'ul ayyi su'alun. The healing of the perplexed, meaning the perplexed here is the one who is perplexed about an issue. He doesn't understand an issue. Shifa'ul ayyi su'alun is to ask someone who is more learned than him, right? Number three, the amal of the Sahaba. At the time of the Sahaba were, there were certain Sahaba who were great fuqaha. Many of the Sahaba were not fuqaha. So from the fuqaha of the Sahaba, we have the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the four rightly guided caliphs, right? And in addition to them, we had the other Sahaba such as Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Umar, Abu Musa al-Ashari, Ubay ibn Ka'ab, Zayd ibn Sabit, who were also great mujtahideen, what we would say were the great muftis of Islam. So in their time, many people asked them questions. How do we pray? How do we how do we fast? How do we do nikah? How do we do transactions? How do we do bay? And so on and so forth. And the Sahaba answered their questions and Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, he mentions this in Al-Mustasfa. He mentions that the Sahaba answered those questions without giving them dalil, without saying this is the evidence. So a man asks a Sahabi who's a mujtahid, who's an alim from fuqaha from the Sahaba. He was asked a question. The Sahabi answered the question, and he didn't say that this is the dalil for it, right? And Imam Amidi, who's another great usuli scholar, he mentions in Al-Ihkam fi Usuli al-Ahkam, Al-Ihkam fi Usuli al-Ahkam, he mentions that the Sahaba, to the point that the Sahaba didn't even rebuke people for not asking for evidence, right? So, for example, if someone asked them a question and they answered the question, hakada, they didn't say, why didn't you look for the dalil? So accepting an understanding about an issue without demanding dalil is proven from the Quran, is proven from the Sunnah, and it's the ijma of the Sahaba, right? And then we have rational evidences. For example, rationally speaking, if you don't know about an issue, who do you ask? You ask someone who is an expert, right? You ask the most expert person. If you're genuinely serious about being healed, you don't go to a layman on the street and you don't go to a medical textbook, right? And you go, what do? You go to a doctor. You go to someone who's an expert in the field of medicine, who's qualified, right? And if you have a greater doctor, you go to the greater doctor, right? And so in the same way, when you have a mas'ala al-shar'i and you're hoping for divine guidance in that, you don't just say go to the Quran and Sunnah without knowledge of the Arabic language, without the usul, without the ilm of nasikh and mansukh and all of these things, and just interpret on your own, right? So going to a scholar or an expert rationally is perfectly fine, you see. As for the ikhtilaf, what's really interesting is the ikhtilaf of the Sahaba, that the Sahaba had ikhtilaf in on certain masail, uh, really passed on to the next generation. And the ikhtilaf really is covered in the four schools of thought. So the ikhtilaf of the Sahaba is covered in the ikhtilaf of the A'immat al-Mujtahideen. So in many ways, the variations of interpretations have all been encapsulated and brought together in the Madahib al-Arba'a. You see, that's why we follow them. And the final aspect is from a rational point of view. For example, if why you might say, I think your question was it that why do we only have four? Why do we have only four? And so, for example, look, as I mentioned, why we only have four is because these four madhahibs, they generally cover the scope of ikhtilaf in the masail, right? So number one, they cover that scope. There's no need for a fifth or a sixth, right? The other thing is, if, for example, we start doing ikhtilaf for ikhtilaf's sake, then it's ad infinitum. It just carries on, and you don't have just four. You have 60,000, and people are confused. People don't know how to worship their maker. People don't know how to do nikah, right? Because there's 60,000 opinions. So this is the rahmah. This is the rahmah and the blessing on the ummah, that the ikhtilaf of the Sahaba, the way they interpreted the certain ahkam, were are all encapsulated and brought together within the scope of the madahibul arba'ah. You see, sorry.
Exactly. So, also just going back to the point about Imam Abu Hanifa, that if a hadith came and a qawl and contradicted, that is for scholars, isn't it?
Yes.
That's
So
not. It's not
yeah.
for the common man to delve into that.
Yeah. So Imam is bin Abdul Salam, he was asked this question: is if there is a person who himself is a scholar, who's reached a level of expertise in discerning law, and he happens to follow another an imam, and he comes across a stronger piece of evidence, then there's and he answers that question. Then for himself, he is permitted to do that. For himself, he's permitted to do that. But as long as he has the qualification for that, right? As long as he has the qualification for that. But as for the laymen do not have that ability. They do not have that level of ijtihad. They do not have that level of depth and understanding for them to start to move from one madhab because of a dalil, right? In most cases, if you've studied your school of thought, you studied it with such a depth and understanding that you know the dalil. But perchance, if there happens to be a dalil which is greater, and the scholar is convinced of that, then according to Imam Izz, he's permitted to do that.
Some people they don't follow mazhab, and they proudly say, "We're allowed to follow mazhab." In reality, they must be getting their Islamic law from somewhere. Where
Yeah,
they're
of course.
getting it from.
So generally speaking, all of the ummah in generality have been following either one of the madhahib al-arba'a, either one of the four schools of thought, generally speaking. Now, those people who deny the ijtihad of the madhahib al-arba'a, they say that we're not going to Abu Hanifa or Malik or Shafi'i or Ahmad bin Hanbal or Saudi and so on and so forth. We're going directly to the Quran, right? They are called the La Madhabiyin, meaning they do not follow madhab. They say they go directly to the Quran and Sunnah. But the reality is, beyond the claim, is that they will also go back to the scholars who interpreted the Quran and Sunnah themselves. And many of them happen to come from the madhab of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. So instead of acknowledging that they're doing the taqleed of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal or his ijtihad or following his guidance in relation to how he perceived the Quran and Sunnah, they claim that they actually following Quran and Sunnah directly, when in reality they're following the same ijtihad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. If they're not following the ijtihad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, like for example, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah was a Hanbali jurist. Imam Ibn Qayyim was a Hanbali jurist, right? But these jurists also studied other schools of thought as well. And when you read their books, their understandings come from the multiplicity of the ikhtilaf of the Sahaba and the multiplicity of the ikhtilaf of the ai in their books. So, so really, those people who say we're following the Quran and Sunnah, they're really following the ijtihad of Ibn Taymiyyah. They're following the ijtihad of Ibn Qayyim, who did exactly the same thing, we would say, in terms of the practical aspect, the same thing that Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal did, Imam Abu Hanifa did. So really, they are doing taqleed, although they will never admit that.
Mm. Are there any instances where someone that follows a dedicated mazhab, he could temporarily, because of the situation, could he follow another imam? Could he follow
Okay.
another mazhab? Is that
Yeah.
permissible?
So that's a really good question, and it's a very pertinent question. Generally speaking, if you follow a certain school of thought, so the hukam of the classical scholars is this, that you are not bound to the school of thought, right? You can change your school of thought. That's a general consensus on that. So Hanafi can become a Shafi'i can become a Hanafi, and there are instances where person was a Shafi, he became Hanafi because he studied and he felt that the adillah of the Hanafi school of thought was more convincing, right? and the instance of that's number one. Number two, generally speaking, when you are a non-scholar and you do not have the tools for interpretation, the scholars say it's better, bal wajib, upon you to stick to your school of thought. Reason why is because uh, for the risk that, for example, you encounter an opinion in another school of thought which happens to be attractive to your nafs, meaning that it's easier perhaps for you to do that, right? And you want to take away that sense of hardship of following your own madhab or the madhab that you've been following, and so then you begin to risk that capacity of risk the situation of picking and choosing, and picking and choosing based on hawa. So for that reason, the scholars have said that you should stick to your own school of thought. However, in extenuating circumstances where following the opinion of your own school of thought is so difficult, the scholars have permitted, completely permitted, even the non-scholars from following the ijtihad of another scholar, right? Ijtihad of another scholar. And bearing in mind that we live in times of immense hardship and difficulty and situations of adversity, the scholars do mention that in situation of complexity, we live in a really bizarre age. The complexity, the confusion is really debilitating to the point where people will have mushaqqa, and the Sharia is a way that brings about ease. Al-mushaqqatu tajlibul yusr. That's a principle, qawaid al-fiqhiyah. When there's hardship, the Shara brings about yusr. Al-amru iza daqa ittasa'a. When an issue becomes narrowed in terms of the inability to follow it, ittasa'a. The Sharia has this principle. One of those principle is to follow the understanding of another mujtahid for that purpose only.
One final
Sorry,
question.
so you didn't want to ask.
We're going to be out of time. I would love to take it, but because we've got to, in the following weeks, we're more than welcome to take any question. We'll answer everything, but not now because we're on a time limit. Final one, Aftab. Some of the brothers say that we follow the earlier generation. So they say we follow the Sahaba. Amongst the Sahaba, we don't find any mazhabs. And how come we can't follow the Sahaba directly?
Of course, that's a really good question. Why weren't there madahib? And the reality is there were madahib in the Sahaba, but the point is that those madahib weren't formulated in the formal sense. So Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib uh, was from the fuqaha of the Sahaba, right? He had an understanding of the murad of Allah and the Messenger. He had a deep, penetrating understanding of the ahkam and so on and so forth, right? Uh, Sayyidina Amir al-Mu'minin Umar ibn al-Khattab had a perspective, an understanding. And so all the Sahaba, they had their own unique understanding of the murad of Allah and the Messenger. They'd witnessed the practical aspect in different circumstances. Uh, but and so those people who asked the questions to those respective Sahaba, they then collected the wisdoms and the teachings of the Sahaba and then passed them on to a next generation. So in many ways, the madahib al-arba are based upon the ijtihadat of the Sahaba. So the knowledge that the Sahaba had, each of the mujtahids, Sahaba, each of them passed their knowledge on to their students, who then passed their knowledge on to their students until it reached the Aimma al-Arba'a, who in many ways codified that, who amalgamated that and collected it, and it took the form. So for example, the fiqh of Abu Hanifa is based in large on the understanding of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, you see. And so the madhahib al-arba, all they do not just appear randomly and basically away from the Sahaba. They in the line of the Sahaba. So the Sahaba, Tabi'in, Taba Tabi'in, and it's all in that same line.
That's all we got time for today. Next week we're off because there's an event at Village Street Masjid that Reflection Path are organizing. We got some Shia youth coming from abroad, especially Sheikh Ismail Kurdi, and we got Dr. Murad Kurdi coming as well. That's going to be on Tasawwuf. So we urge all brothers to attend that also. Following week, 14th of August, there might be a podcast, but you will, inshallah, will update you on that. Next time you see us, inshallah, here again will be on the 21st of August. And here's where we're going to go into the actual fiqh issues of the contemporary era. So that week, we're going to look at the economic and the business related issues directly. So things to do with taking a loan, shares, buying shares, stock market, all those pertinent questions. We're going to straight away go into the fiqh aspect straight away.
Sorry, do you want to ask? We don't have enough time to ask.
We haven't got time as well.
Okay.
We got to do after because we're stuck in time and we would love to answer it. But now what we'll do inshallah is we just want to